Under the flicker of a grocery store light, a veteran stood in silence with his loyal German shepherd. Across the counter, a tattooed biker in a torn vest was being accused of stealing. Voices hissed, eyes judged, whispers spread like fire. But here's the question. What would you do if the only way to protect someone's dignity was to spend your very last dollar? What followed shook the town, thundered through 300 roaring engines, and proved that even in the harshest places, brotherhood and hope can rise again. Before we dive in, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe for more stories of loyalty, redemption, and second chances. The late autumn sky hung low over the small town of Maple Hollow. Gray clouds pressed together like weary shoulders, and the air smelled faintly of damp leaves and old pine smoke drifting from distant chimneys. The streets were quiet except for the occasional rattle of a loose shutter or the cry of a crow flying above, and even the cracked sidewalk seemed tired of bearing so many footsteps worn thin by time. In that silence, a man walked slowly toward the edge of town, his German shepherd close by his side, their figures framed against the dull horizon as if they alone carried the weight of another world. His name was David Miller, 45 years old, tall and still strong in frame, though life had carved its marks into his body. His hazel-brown hair, once vibrant, now carried threads of gray, and along his jaw stretched a thin beard sprinkled with silver. His face was not ugly nor plain. It was rugged in the way of men who had faced too much sun, dust, and wind, handsome in a somber way. The lines around his eyes carved not by laughter, but by sleepless nights and memories he could never bury. He wore a beige work shirt, frayed at the collar, tucked into jeans so faded the knees had nearly given way, and boots scarred by years of walking roads that led nowhere in particular. Though he carried no visible scars, the way his shoulders hunched slightly forward, as if ready to brace against a blow that might come at any moment, betrayed the hidden wounds of war that no medic could stitch closed. Beside him padded Rocky, a German shepherd of 5 years, with a sable coat that caught the light in subtle shades of black and brown. His ears were sharp, his eyes a deep amber that flicked left and right as though guarding every shadow. Rocky was not merely a dog, he was a soldier in his own right, though his battles were of loyalty rather than steel. His body bore no scars, but his gait carried the discipline of training, each step measured, each glance alert. Yet when his gaze turned up toward David, all sternness melted into a look of devotion, the kind that reminded David there was at least one living soul who had never abandoned him. David's mind drifted as he walked. Years ago, before Iraq and Afghanistan, before sandstorms and gunfire, before the loneliness of sleeping under alien skies, he had owned a little repair shop. The shop smelled of cedar planks and varnish, of sawdust and paint thinner. Back then, his hands, though calloused, had been sure, steady, and always welcome. He fixed broken chairs, patched window frames, and built shelves for neighbors who never had enough space. People trusted him not because of paperwork or contracts, but because of his word. He remembered one winter when old Mrs. Callahan's window had jammed during a snowstorm. He had shut down his store early, grabbed his crowbar, and fixed it without ever sending her a bill. She had brought him apple pie for weeks after that, saying kindness deserved kindness. Now those days felt like echoes trapped in another life. The shop was long gone, lost to debts and whispers of rumors he had never been able to disprove. His wife had left, suitcase in hand, their son holding her arm, as they disappeared into the back seat of her sister's car 3 states away. He hadn't fought to stop them, not because he didn't care, but because shame had already hollowed him out. People who once drank his coffee and borrowed his ladder had crossed the street when they saw him coming. Trust, once broken, was heavier to carry than any wooden beam. As he neared the edge of town, Rocky barked softly, sensing David's thoughts sinking again. David reached down, brushing his fingers along the dog's fur, feeling the warmth. "I know, boy," he murmured. "We're still standing." The dog's tail wagged once, steady and strong, as if to say that was enough. David lived not in a home, but in what could generously be called a shack. It stood beyond the railroad tracks, half hidden by a thicket of sumac and pine. The roof sagged under the weight of too many seasons, the boards were split and weather-stained, and when it rained, water found every gap to drip through. Inside there was a cot pushed against the wall, a stove that coughed more smoke than fire, and a single table where David sometimes wrote letters he never sent. The neighbors called it a hut or a shed, but to David it was simply shelter, the one place he could lay down without feeling the eyes of others judge him. Rocky had a corner near the cot, with an old wool blanket that smelled of earth and dog, but he never seemed to mind. When David returned from work at the lumber yard each evening, his body aching from lifting beams heavier than his tired muscles should have borne, he sat on the edge of the cot and stared at his hands. They were thick, knotted with veins, the nails chipped, the palms rough as sandpaper. Once, these hands had built, created, offered. Now they simply carried and dropped, for wages that vanished before the week was through. Sometimes he imagined the wood he hauled had voices, whispering of houses being built somewhere he would never live, of walls rising strong for families who would never know his name. It was a cruel irony to help build homes, while his own life remained roofless in all but form. Still, he tried to hold on to something small, his dignity. Every morning, he shaved as best he could, trimming his thin beard so that the silver lines seemed neat rather than careless. He kept his shirt tucked in, even if the fabric was frayed, and he washed his boots in the creek whenever mud swallowed them whole. Pride, though battered, refused to die completely. That stubborn ember was the only thing keeping him from collapsing entirely. At times, he thought of reaching out, to his son, now a teenager somewhere far away. He wondered if the boy remembered the afternoons they had built birdhouses, together in the back of the shop, or if those memories had been buried under resentment and the steady drip of his mother's bitterness. David couldn't blame her. A woman deserved stability, not rumors and debts. But still, at night, when the wind pushed through the cracks of his shack and Rocky pressed close for warmth, David whispered apologies no one could hear. The town saw him as a ghost, a reminder of what happened when fortune and faith deserted a man. Yet to Rocky, he was everything. When strangers passed, Rocky stood tall, protective, as though daring anyone to insult the man who fed him, even when David himself went hungry. That loyalty was a mirror to David's own heart, reminding him he was not yet invisible, not yet erased. One evening, after a long day at the lumber yard, David walked home through the dying light. He paused at the corner of Main Street where his repair shop had once stood. The building was gone, replaced by a laundromat with humming machines and neon lights. He stood there for a moment, Rocky sitting at his heel, and remembered the laughter of children who once painted wooden toy cars in his shop, the smell of coffee brewing on a small hot plate, the steady rhythm of hammer on nail. It was like staring at a photograph of himself he no longer recognized. David sighed, placing his hand on Rocky's head. "We keep moving," he said softly, as though speaking to himself as much as to the dog. Rocky leaned into his touch, solid and unwavering, and together they walked into the growing night. The morning after the rain was pale and washed out, the sky above Maple Hollow holding a thin grayness that seemed to seep into the very bones of the town. The air was heavy with the smell of wet leaves and chimney smoke, and puddles clung stubbornly to the uneven pavement of Main Street. David Miller walked slowly, boots scuffing against the cracked sidewalk, with Rocky at his side. The German shepherd's sable coat still carried a faint dampness from the night, and his amber eyes darted at every shifting sound. David's beige shirt, frayed at the collar, clung to his shoulders, and his faded jeans hung loosely on his lean frame. He walked not with the briskness of a man rushing toward purpose, but with the steady rhythm of someone who had long ago surrendered to the drag of routine. Passers-by noticed him. They always did. A woman tightening her scarf leaned closer to her husband and whispered, "That's the soldier who lost his shop." The words cut the cold air sharper than the wind itself. Another voice, belonging to a thin-faced man stepping out of the bakery, muttered, "Always with that dog, never with work that lasts." David's jaw tensed, but his lips pressed into the ghost of a smile, a mask he had learned to wear like armor. Rocky's ears flicked back, his body tensing as if he could sense the weight of judgment. Then the dog looked up at his master, eyes softening, tail wagging once, and David reached down to brush his hand across Rocky's head. "Easy, boy," he murmured, as much to himself as to the animal. At the corner of Elm and Fifth stood the small grocery run by Sarah Whitmore. Sarah was a woman in her mid-50s, tall and spare, her posture straight, despite years of carrying burdens no one else could see. Her hair, once black as coal, had surrendered to silver, tied neatly into a bun at the nape of her neck. She wore a plain cardigan and an apron that bore the faint white smudges of flour, her face carrying both the lines of past laughter and the newer creases of caution. Sarah had inherited the store from her late husband after his sudden heart attack more than a decade earlier. Once, she had been known for her open-hearted kindness, but a cousin's betrayal, money borrowed and never repaid, had left her cautious. She still had compassion, but it came guarded, parceled out carefully so she would not be taken advantage of again. Years earlier, she had been one of David's regular customers when he still ran his repair shop. He had once fixed a sagging shelf for her, refusing payment with a smile. She had brought him apple pie in return. That memory lingered whenever she saw him enter her store now, diminished, but still carrying the remnants of dignity. When he stepped inside that morning, with Rocky waiting obediently outside, she straightened and offered a small nod. "Morning, David," she said softly, her eyes flicking toward the door to make sure the dog remained calm. David returned the nod, picking up a loaf of bread, a tin of beans, and a packet of cheap instant coffee. He laid the items on the counter and pulled a few damp bills from his pocket. Sarah took them and counted the change, noticing the tremor in his knuckles. For a moment, she wanted to say something kind, but she swallowed it, aware of the eyes of other customers. She handed him his change and murmured, "Take care." He nodded once, thanked her, and left without raising his eyes. Outside, Rocky wagged his tail, pressing his nose against the bag. David crouched, scratching the dog behind the ears. "Half of it's yours," he whispered, a hint of warmth breaking through his tired voice. "We don't have much, but we've got each other. That's enough." Rocky barked softly, his eyes shining with loyalty that asked for nothing more than presence. The days blended together, each one a weary echo of the last. At the lumber yard, when they called him, David hauled beams, stacked boards, and swept sawdust until his arms throbbed and his back ached. The foreman, a broad man named Bill Carver, ran the yard with a sharp tongue but a practical fairness. Bill, in his early 50s, carried the bulk of a man built from years of lifting more than paperwork. His hair was thinning, his face square and shaded by a perpetual stubble. He respected hard work, but had little patience for excuses. "Miller," he barked one afternoon, tossing David a pair of gloves. "You're strong enough for 2 men, so act like it." There was no cruelty in his voice, only the rough edge of a man who had never known any softer way to speak. David bent to his task without reply, sweat dripping into his eyes, silently grateful that work, no matter how punishing, was still offered. When there was no call from the lumber yard, David wandered the edges of town, searching for odd jobs. Most doors closed politely, excuses ready on tongues, but some remembered him, if not with warmth, at least with recognition. One such man was Henry Lawson, a farmer in his 60s, his body built thick from decades of plowing fields. His beard, white and bristly, covered a face carved deep with lines of worry. He wore denim overalls and heavy boots that clumped against the earth like stones. Henry had grown up during the Great Depression, taught to distrust charity and respect only labor. When David arrived to fix the barn door, Henry eyed him critically. "Thought soldiers came back with more grit," he muttered, handing him a hammer. David felt the sting, but swallowed his pride, working silently while Rocky circled the barn, sniffing the corners with curiosity. Hours later, the barn door swung smoothly on its hinges again. Henry studied the work, lips twitching as if torn between scorn and approval. At last, he pressed more money into David's hand than expected. "Don't waste it," he said, his voice gruff but softer than before. It was Henry's own language of acknowledgement, and David accepted it with a quiet nod. That night, David sat by the sputtering stove in his shack. The bread and beans shared with Rocky tasted better than any feast because they were earned. He watched the flames flicker and thought of Corporal Jennings, the lanky Texan with sandy hair whose laughter had once filled the desert nights. Jennings had told him, "When you get back, don't let them tell you you're finished. Build again, brother, build again." Jennings had died in a roadside blast, and the memory weighed heavy. David whispered into the dim light, "I'll build again, Jennings. Somehow." Rocky laid his head on David's knee, eyes full of understanding, his steady breath grounding David in the present. The next morning, he walked through town again. Sarah swept outside her store, pausing for a moment longer than usual as he passed. Perhaps she was remembering that broken shelf, Or perhaps she was simply seeing the man behind the whispers. Down the street, Henry's pickup rumbled past, and the farmer gave the faintest lift of his hand, something between a wave and a shrug. It was more acknowledgement than David had grown used to. Still, others stared, their eyes heavy with suspicion, their voices soft but sharp. Yet inside David stirred something faint but alive, a fragile ember of hope refusing to die, an ember born of Rocky's steady presence and the quiet gestures of those who, in their own guarded ways, had not completely turned their backs. The rain came hard that evening, sweeping across Maple Hollow in thick sheets, rattling against rusted gutters and pooling in the potholes of Main Street. The lamplight outside the grocery store flickered against the wet pavement, reflecting the shapes of tired townsfolk scurrying home. Inside the store, the hum of fluorescent lights mingled with the steady tap of water dripping from coats and umbrellas. David Miller pushed the door open, shoulders damp from the storm, with Rocky close behind. The German shepherd shook himself at the entrance, sending a spray of water onto the mat, then sat dutifully as David entered, his amber eyes scanning the aisles. David's boots squeaked softly on the linoleum as he moved toward the shelves. His beige shirt clung damply to his back, and his jeans carried the stains of mud and labor. He picked up a loaf of bread and a small packet of coffee, holding them carefully as if they were treasures rather than necessities. He planned to be quick, to return home with Rocky before the storm worsened. But as he neared the checkout counter, a commotion stirred. A man stood there already, a broad figure in a cracked leather vest, his bare arms showing the ink of faded tattoos. Beneath the vest was only a threadbare tank top, once white but now stained with sweat and age. His hair, dark and tangled, hung damp across his forehead, and his jaw carried stubble grown unevenly, as though he had long ago given up on grooming. His name, though David did not know it yet, was Jake Turner. At 40, Jake looked older than his years, his face carrying the weary lines of someone who had been through bar fights, long nights, and the kind of roads that didn't forgive mistakes. His eyes, however, betrayed something softer, an ache hidden beneath the roughness, a shame that clung to him heavier than the storm outside. The cashier, Linda Myers, a thin woman in her late 30s with pale skin and tightly pulled blonde hair, crossed her arms at the counter. Her lips pressed into a hard line, and her eyes narrowed as she stared at the basket before Jake. "It declined again," she said sharply, sliding the card back across the counter. Her voice was pitched high, not with concern, but with accusation. Behind Jake, a few customers had gathered. A heavy-set man in a brown jacket whispered, "He's stealing!" A young mother clutched her purse tighter, pulling her little boy closer. The boy peeked out from behind her coat, wide-eyed, watching the scene unfold. Rocky, from his spot at the doorway, sensed the rising tension. His ears perked, his body stiffened, and he gave a low growl that silenced even the squeak of shoes against the floor. Jake's voice cracked as he tried to explain. "I just need the milk and bread. My card's gotta have enough." His words fell flat, drowned by the murmurs around him. The security guard, Tom Daniels, stepped forward. Tom was in his 50s, tall and thick-shouldered, his once black hair gone almost fully gray. He had been a mechanic once, before a back injury pushed him into easier work, and years of disappointment had made him rigid. He placed his hand on his belt, not yet touching the radio clipped there, but the gesture was enough to frame Jake as a threat in the eyes of the crowd. David paused, gripping his loaf of bread tighter. He saw the tattoos, the leather vest, the wild look in Jake's eyes, but what struck him deeper was the shame etched across the man's face, the same shame David himself had worn years ago when rumors had destroyed his name. His chest tightened as the memory rose, the whispers outside his shuttered shop, neighbors turning their eyes away, his wife closing the suitcase without a word. He knew what it was to be judged before explaining, to stand alone while the crowd believed the worst. Linda's voice rose, sharp as glass. "If you can't pay, you need to leave before I call the police." Jake lowered his head, shoulders curling inward. For a moment he looked less like a man and more like someone waiting for the final blow. David could not move at first, frozen by the weight of recognition. Then Rocky growled again, low and steady, as if urging him forward. David stepped closer, his boots echoing against the floor. The murmurs quieted. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the last of his crumpled bills. They were damp from the rain, wrinkled and thin, but he laid them on the counter one by one. "Use mine," he said, his voice steady but low. Linda blinked, her expression caught between surprise and disdain. "You don't have to," she began, but David cut her off with a look. His hazel eyes, worn yet firm, met hers in silence. The cashier faltered, then turned reluctantly to ring up the items. Jake's head snapped up, his dark eyes wide. "No, I can't," he began, reaching to push the money back. But David closed his hand gently over Jake's wrist, not with force, but with the calm weight of someone who had nothing left to fear. "It's done," David said quietly. "Take it." The crowd had no words. The heavyset man who had whispered, "He's stealing," shifted uncomfortably, looking down at his boots. The young mother pulled her boy closer, but her eyes softened slightly as she watched. Even Tom, the security guard, loosened his stance, his hand falling away from his belt. Rocky padded forward then, sitting squarely beside David, his gaze sweeping across the room. His presence was commanding, as if he were guarding not just his master, but the dignity of the stranger David had chosen to defend. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting shadows across the cracked linoleum, and for a heartbeat, the whole store seemed to hold its breath. Jake swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had been in fights, in jails, in alleys where no one cared if he stood or fell. But this moment, standing beside a man who had nothing and yet gave anyway, broke through the armor he had built around himself. He lowered his gaze and muttered, "Thank you." His voice was hoarse, the words dragged from a place unused to gratitude. David did not answer. He gathered his bread and coffee, gestured to Rocky, and began to walk toward the door. As he passed the others, he felt their eyes on him, less sharp, less cruel, more uncertain. He had not given a speech, nor demanded respect, but the act itself had carved silence deeper than any words could. When the door swung open, the storm outside greeted him with a gust of wind. Rocky trotted at his side, shaking droplets from his fur, and David pulled his collar up against the rain. Behind them, the whispers had ceased. The crowd had no conclusion to cling to, only the image of a veteran and his dog standing for someone the world had already condemned. For David, the money lost meant hunger tomorrow. But for tonight, he walked out into the storm with Rocky at his side, carrying something heavier than hunger, yet lighter than despair. The knowledge that even stripped of everything, he still had the power to choose mercy. The storm that had battered Maple Hollow eased by morning, leaving behind a sheen of rain on the sidewalks and the smell of wet earth drifting through the narrow streets. The grocery store where David had laid down his last bills still carried the echo of what had happened the night before. The aisles were silent now, stocked again, lights humming as if nothing extraordinary had taken place. But those who had stood in line, who had seen Rocky's sharp gaze and David's quiet defiance, could not return to silence. The first retelling began at Marvin's Diner, a small place at the end of Main Street, where locals gathered over weak coffee and stacks of pancakes. Eddie Collins, a lanky young man of 21, had been there that night, his baseball cap dripping water as he shielded his phone from the rain while waiting for the bus outside the store. Eddie was wiry, with a mop of brown hair that refused to stay tamed under his cap, freckles across his nose, and a restless energy in every movement. His family had been in Maple Hollow for generations, but Eddie often felt invisible, working shifts at the gas station and dreaming of roads that led far beyond the county lines. What he saw at the grocery store, however, gave him something he hadn't felt in a long while, a story worth telling. Over coffee and eggs, Eddie leaned across the booth to his friend, gesturing with wide hands. "I swear, man, it was like a movie. This vet, David Miller, you know the guy with the dog? He stepped up, dropped his last bills like it was nothing, and shut everybody up. The whole place froze." His friend raised skeptical brows, but Eddie's excitement was contagious. Within an hour, other diners were listening in, nodding, whispering, the tale stretching and growing as it left Eddie's lips. By lunchtime, Marvin himself, a barrel-shaped man with a salt and pepper mustache and a permanent grease stain on his apron, was repeating the story to newcomers with added details. "That shepherd looked ready to tear the whole room apart if anyone touched his master," he said with a chuckle, though his eyes held a flicker of respect. By afternoon, the story had reached the bus station, where travelers and townsfolk alike found themselves talking about it between schedules. An older woman with tired eyes and calloused hands told her seatmate, "That soldier gave everything for a man he didn't even know. Reminds me of the parables Father Reed reads in church." Her voice trembled with something between awe and shame. Others nodded, exchanging theories, piecing together fragments they had heard. The details shifted. The number of bills David laid down, the sharpness of Rocky's growl, but the heart of it remained untouched. A poor veteran had chosen dignity over silence. At St. Mary's Church, Father Reed himself heard the whispers before evening mass. Father Reed was a tall, spare man in his 60s with thinning gray hair and a voice that carried calm, authority. His face bore the kindness of someone who had buried half the town, yet still found hope in every hymn. He listened as parishioners described the scene with hushed reverence. "A man gave all he had," one said, "for someone others spat on." Reed folded his hands and murmured, "There is no greater sermon than what we live." David, unaware of the stir his actions had caused, walked the muddy path back to his shack with Rocky at his side. The wind bit cold through the cracks of his walls, and the roof leaked from places he no longer had strength to mend. He peeled off his damp shirt, fed Rocky half of the bread he'd carried home, and lay on the narrow cot with the dog curled against him. Rocky's steady warmth was the only comfort against the draft that whistled through holes in the tin roof. David closed his eyes, exhausted, never knowing that even as he drifted into restless sleep, strangers across town were speaking his name with newfound respect. The story spread not through printed words or glowing screens, but on the breath of people who could not keep it contained. At the hardware store, old men leaning on counters shook their heads. "Maybe we judged him too quick," one admitted, rubbing his jaw. At the barber's shop, where gossip often grew sharper than the scissors, a woman sighed. "I used to cross the street when I saw him, but maybe we've all been too silent, too cruel." Even those who had whispered the loudest found themselves uneasy. Harold Green, the man who had hissed, "He's stealing," in the grocery line, lay awake that night staring at his ceiling. Harold was in his 50s, with thinning hair and a belly grown soft from years of desk work at the post office. He was not malicious by nature, but had long carried the habit of siding with the crowd, letting suspicion replace thought. The memory of Rocky's eyes, unwavering and protective, gnawed at him. He turned in bed, muttering to his wife, "Maybe I should have kept my mouth shut." By the week's end, David had become, without knowing it, the subject of quiet reckoning. At Marvin's diner, people lowered their voices when he passed, no longer sneering, but not yet ready to greet him openly. At church, Father Reed wove a subtle message into his sermon. When one man spends his last coin to defend the dignity of another, we are all called to ask, what coin are we still clutching in fear? The congregation listened, some with tears glinting in their eyes. David remained oblivious, moving through his days as before, working odd jobs, walking Rocky along the edges of town, sharing scraps by candlelight in his shack. His thoughts stayed on survival, not reputation. But the town was shifting, quietly, like soil softening before seeds take root. In the silence of their kitchens, in the pews of the church, on the benches at the bus stop, more and more voices whispered the same confession. Maybe we've been quiet too long in the face of injustice. Rocky, lying at David's feet each night, seemed to sense the change in the air, his ears twitching toward distant sounds, his eyes calm. David only saw the cracked roof, the hunger of tomorrow, and the dog that never left his side. But outside, the ground was moving, the story spreading, preparing for something larger than either man or dog could yet imagine. The morning broke cold and sharp, the kind of late winter dawn that painted every breath in white mist and left the frost clinging to the edges of weeds outside David's shack. He had risen early, as always, lighting a small fire in the dented stove, feeding Rocky half a crust of bread before pouring himself the last of the bitter coffee. His shack creaked against the wind, the roof whining as if it might tear loose at any moment. Rocky shifted beside him, tail thumping the floorboards, ears twitching toward a distant sound. It began as a faint rumble, a vibration threading through the frozen ground. Then it grew louder, engines, heavy and insistent, mixed with the crunch of car tires on gravel. David stood quickly, confusion knitting his brow. Rocky leapt to the door, barking, his tail wagging high. Outside, the dirt road that rarely saw visitors filled suddenly with machines and men. At the front, straddling a battered Harley-Davidson, was the tattooed man from the grocery store. His leather vest still bore its scars, his tank top faded and thin beneath, tattoos dark across his shoulders. But his face, once shadowed by shame, carried something new now, a steadiness, a purpose. He cut the engine, swung a leg off the bike, and strode toward the shack. Rocky barked but did not lunge, his keen eyes recognizing the man. David stepped onto the porch, bewildered. The biker stopped a few paces away. "Name's Jake Turner," he said, his voice deep, gravelly, but steady. His eyes met David's with the same intensity that once carried despair, but now carried gratitude. "You gave me hope when I had none. Now it's my turn." Behind Jake, the road filled with figures. A cluster of bikers leaned against their bikes, leather jackets creaking as they nodded respectfully. Mixed among them stood men in heavy coats, their posture unmistakable, veterans. Some had weathered faces lined by years, others still carried the tautness of middle age, but all bore the quiet weight of men who had seen too much. Then came the townsfolk. Sarah Whitmore, tall and spare, her silver hair tied back neatly, carried a covered tray in her arms. Her breath showed in the cold air, but her steps were firm as she walked toward the shack. "Bread," she said softly, her eyes glinting. "Still warm." Behind her, Marvin, the barrel-chested diner owner, carried a thermos in each hand, the smell of hot coffee wafting in the air. He grinned beneath his mustache, his voice booming. "Couldn't let you freeze out here without something warm." From the back of a pickup truck, Tom Daniels, the gray-haired security guard, who once stood ready to accuse Jake, lifted down a bundle of lumber. His breath came heavy, his face flushed from the weight, but he set it down with determination. "It's time to build something better than whispers," he muttered, not quite meeting David's eyes. Even Henry Lawson, the stern farmer, stood with his arms crossed, a bag of nails, hooked to his belt. His face was still carved from suspicion, but his eyes carried a flicker of respect. "You fixed my barn," he said simply. "Guess I owe you more than I thought." Rocky darted in circles around them all, barking joyously, tail sweeping the air like a banner. The atmosphere was alive, hammers clanking from trucks, boots thudding across frozen ground, voices mixing in a hum of purpose. The desolate clearing before David's shack, once filled only with silence and cold, now buzzed with energy. Jake stepped closer. "You don't know what that night did for me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was ready to fall deeper than I ever had. Then you stepped in, no questions asked. That kind of mercy. It makes a man want to stand tall again. So here we are." He gestured to the crowd, engines idling behind them, like thunder waiting to roll. "Brothers, neighbors, folks you thought forgot you. We came because you gave us a reason to remember what's right." David's throat tightened. He had faced soldiers and storms, judgment and hunger. But he had not expected this. He looked from face to face, Sarah's quiet compassion, Marvin's grin, Tom's repentant strength, Henry's guarded acknowledgement, and felt a warmth rise that even the frost could not touch. His hazel eyes stung, and for a moment he could not speak. Rocky pressed against his leg, steadying him. "You don't owe me anything," David finally said, his voice hoarse. "I just did what I had to do." Jake shook his head firmly. "No, you did what the rest of us should have done. That makes all the difference." The clatter of tools began as men unloaded planks, hammers, and saws. Women carried baskets of food. Children brought bundles of blankets. Someone set a kettle on a makeshift fire, steam curling into the morning sky. The ground that had echoed with silence now rang with life, boots stomping, laughter rising, voices calling directions. Sarah placed her tray on a small table, then turned to David. "You carried your pride alone long enough," she said gently. "Let us carry some of it now." Rocky barked again, circling the workers as if urging them on. Children giggled, chasing him through the mud. The dog's coat glistened in the weak sunlight, his amber eyes alight with excitement. It was as if he knew this was his master's turning point. David stood in the doorway of his shack, his rough hands curling around the frame. The cold wind still bit, but within him stirred something warmer than he had known in years, a fragile but steady flame of belonging. He whispered to Rocky, though his voice carried to those nearest, "We're not alone anymore." And for the first time in a long while, he believed it. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, spilling gold across the edges of Maple Hollow as the sound of hammers and saws finally began to fade. What had once been a sagging shack with walls too thin to keep out the wind was now a sturdy frame of fresh pine and oak, the scent of sawdust mixed with coffee and sweat lingering in the air as neighbors and bikers alike stepped back to admire what they had built. David stood at the edge of the porch, his boots in the dirt, eyes wide as if he hardly dared to believe what rose before him. The house was not grand, nor was it flawless. Its walls were plain, the roof slanted, and the porch narrow. Yet it was solid, crafted with care, every board nailed straight, every window fitted snug. On the porch, someone had placed David's old chair, the one that had leaned against the wall of his shack for years, weathered gray by rain and time. Beside it lay a fresh padded mat, thick and soft, meant for Rocky. The German Shepherd padded over immediately, circling once before lying down, tail thumping against the new wood as his amber eyes gleamed with contentment. Inside, a table stood in the center of the room, simple but strong, its surface gleaming from the careful work of men who had sanded it smooth. Above it, hung by a nail on the wall, was a hammer. The handle was worn, the head nicked and darkened by years of use. It was David's old hammer, the only tool he had saved when his shop had been closed and his world had unraveled. He had kept it tucked away, unable to use it, yet unwilling to let it go. Now it hung like a relic, a sign that something once broken had been set right again. The townsfolk gathered inside, their boots thudding against the new floorboards. Sarah Whitmore, tall and dignified, placed a basket of bread on the table. Her silver hair slipped from its bun as she wiped sweat from her brow, her eyes soft as she looked around. Marvin, the diner owner with the booming laugh, carried in steaming pots of stew, filling the room with the rich smell of herbs and broth. His round face glowed with pride as he ladled portions into bowls. Jake Turner stood a little apart, leaning against the doorway, his tattooed arms crossed over his chest. The leather vest still clung to his frame, but his posture was no longer slouched with shame. His dark eyes, once clouded, now held a quiet gratitude. He had worked harder than most that day, his calloused hands blistered from swinging a hammer, his voice rough from shouting directions. Yet his smile, though small, came easier now. Beside him stood Tom Daniels, the grizzled security guard who had once eyed him with suspicion. Tom's broad shoulders sagged with fatigue, but there was a peace in his face as he accepted a bowl of stew from Marvin. "Didn't think I'd be building houses at my age," Tom muttered, but when he looked at David, there was respect in his eyes. Henry Lawson, the stern farmer, entered carrying a bucket of nails that had gone unused, setting them neatly in a corner. His weathered face softened just slightly as he nodded to David. "Solid work," he said, the highest praise Henry ever gave. As dusk deepened, someone carried in a wooden plaque. It was hand-carved, the letters uneven but bold, the edges rough but full of character. The sign read, "David's Repairs, open again." Jake held it up, his tattooed hands steady. "This belongs here," he said, his voice carrying across the room. Together, a few men hammered it into place above the wall, the sound echoing like a heartbeat through the new house. David's chest tightened as he looked around the room. His hazel eyes glistened, his throat constricting as he tried to find words. He thought of the nights he had slept hungry, the whispers that had followed him, the loneliness that had wrapped around his shack like chains. He thought of the night at the grocery store, Rocky at his side, when he had laid down his last bills without knowing what it would cost him. Now he saw faces, neighbors, strangers, bikers, veterans, standing under his roof, eating from his table, rebuilding not just his home, but his dignity. "I thought I had lost my faith," David said finally, his voice breaking, steadying again as he spoke louder. "But tonight, you gave it back. You built me a house, but more than that. You built me a reason to believe again." Jake stepped forward, resting a heavy hand on David's shoulder. His tattoos caught the light, the ink dark against his skin, but his smile was unguarded. "No one stands alone," he said firmly. "Not anymore. Today you have a home, and it's ours too." A murmur of agreement rose from the crowd, voices overlapping. "That's right. Amen. We're with you." Sarah placed her hand on David's arm, her touch gentle. Marvin laughed, clapping him on the back. Even Henry nodded once, the closest he came to affection. Rocky barked loudly then, tail wagging, eyes shining as if he understood the moment. He lay back down on his mat at the porch, his gaze sweeping over the people gathered in the home that was now more than walls. It was built from kindness, from redemption, from the choice to do better when silence had failed them before. The night grew darker, lanterns were lit, and laughter replaced the hush of loneliness. David stood in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame of his new home. The wind still blew, the world was still hard, but here was proof that brokenness could be mended, that strangers could become family, and that trust could be rebuilt nail by nail. In the end, the story of David and his loyal German shepherd Rocky was never just about a crumbling shack or the roar of 100 engines. It was about how a man once broken by war and burdened by silence could stand tall again, not because he asked for help, but because he chose to give it first. The little wooden house on the edge of town became more than shelter. It became a symbol of what happens when dignity, loyalty, and compassion are given a second chance. Perhaps this is how God works among us, not through lightning or wealth, but through simple acts of courage, through the steady presence of a dog who never left his master's side, and through neighbors who remembered what it means to stand together. Miracles are often disguised as the sound of hammers on wood, the laughter of strangers turning into friends, and the faith that what is broken can be made whole. So, as you hear this story, ask yourself, what gift has God placed in your hands that could lift someone else? Is it your voice, your work, your time, or just your willingness to stand beside someone in need? Use it, share it. For the true legacy we leave is not built in wood or stone, but in love and hope given freely. If this story touched your heart, drop a comment below, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe for more stories of loyalty, redemption, and second chances. May God bless you and your loved ones with courage, peace, and enduring grace.